Greetings from Hong Kong. I'm Keith Richburg. I'm at the Foreign Correspondents Club, where I'm a correspondent governor, and I'm also in my day job, the director of the Journalism and Media Studies Center at the University of Hong Kong. This is one of our FCC Zoom series speaker events. So please keep in touch with us at fcchk.org to find out our upcoming Zoom events. I can tell you now that the next one we have coming up is on Monday, July 20th, where we're going to be speaking with Jeffrey Sachs, who you might know, who's one of the world's foremost economists, and he is the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. So please do sign up for that one. But for today, I am very honored to welcome a guest who is not in the room where this is happening now. It's Ambassador John Bolton. I'm in the room here in Hong Kong at the Foreign Correspondents Club, but he wrote the book, The Room Where It Happened, which you can get on Amazon. It's still one of the best sellers on Amazon. Ambassador Bolton, I've always wanted to say a guest needs no introduction, but I think I can actually really say that with Ambassador John Bolton. He was in every administration going back to the Reagan administration, including George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, and where he served as ambassador to the United Nations. And so I would like to, and actually most recently, he was the National Security Advisor for President Trump, a period that he writes about in this new book, The Room Where It Happened, a White House memoir. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ambassador John Bolton. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks very much. This is one of those occasions where I can say I really do wish I were in Hong Kong in the room at the Foreign Correspondents Club with everything going on, but glad to be here remotely in any event.
Well, thank you for joining us. We're really glad that you're able to do this for us. It really is important for our members. It's important for all the people coming in here. I think we've got a record audience in Zoom for this. So without further ado, I'll waste no time and just jump right into it. I'm going to ask you a few questions first as moderator, and then we're going to open it up to our members who are online and going to be sending in their questions. And if you are online on Zoom, do feel free to send in your questions in the chat box. But Ambassador Bolton, it's actually really fortuitous that we have you now because President Trump has just signed the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, and he's also separately signed an executive order that would end Hong Kong's preferential treatment. And I just want to ask you, China is now threatening to retaliate for this. It sounds to me like we're almost in a new Cold War situation, like with the Soviets, where we did something, they retaliated, et cetera. I mean, is that where we are now? What do you think of the president's actions? And are we now in some kind of a new Cold War with China?
Well, I think a lot has changed. I think that in the U.S. as a whole, I think attitudes on China are shifting dramatically and really on a bipartisan basis. And I would say, and I go through this at some length in the book, I think U.S. policy toward China as a whole for about 4 decades or more has rested on 2 premises. Number one, that is China abandoned Marxist principles and grew wealthier, spread across the population. It would be a more responsible actor in international affairs. It would fit into the international world order. It would be a peaceful rise, and China would become a responsible stakeholder. I think China's actions in its military buildup, its actions in the South China Sea, East China Sea, cyberspace, along the Indian border most recently, demonstrate that hypothesis is wrong. Second hypothesis was as wealth accumulates, China will become more democratic. Those village elections out in remote parts of China will become provincial elections, then they'll become national elections. That hypothesis is wrong. Xi Jinping is the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao Zedong. So the fundamental precepts of U.S. policy, at least, have proven wrong. And I think as people look at China's conduct kind of across the board, attitudes are changing. I think Hong Kong in particular is very visible, something well known to Americans more broadly than a lot of other Chinese issues. And therefore, it's become a focal point. But this is part of a much longer historical shift, I believe.
Yeah, Ambassador, in your book, in the chapter called Thunder Out of China, I just read the book, you accuse China of stealing intellectual property, engaging in corrupt practices, playing the debt diplomacy card, and you write, and I quote, "It's essential that enough Americans see the nature of China's challenge to act in time to stop it." I mean, exactly what should America and the Western countries do, given the fact that China is the world's second largest economy and they've got so much clout in the world?
Well, it in part because they got to be the second largest economy by stealing and cheating. And it's great when you can bring products into competition with the people whose intellectual property you stole from them. And this is not simply an American point of view, that I can assure you. If you look at opinions in political leadership in the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Singapore, nobody doubts this is true. And I do think, for all my disagreements with Trump, he has one point correct, and that is that economic strength is the foundation of political and military strength. So that readjusting China's economy is a fundamental part of dealing with their threats around the world. And they manifest themselves in a lot of ways. You listed some from the book, but I would say because the U.S. looks at regime, certainly the quality, the nature of a regime is something I've always focused on. It's why I look at North Korea and Iran in a particular way. The regime in Beijing has a pretty lamentable record on a range of issues, like honoring international agreements, like the handover agreement with the United Kingdom, like repression of religious freedom in China, like its mistreatment of the Uyghurs. I mean, I could go on. The civil military fusion in China, the social metrics that China is compiling about its own population. So this is a huge shift in perception of China. I think America lagged in many respects. It was Australia and New Zealand, for example, that saw the threat of Huawei really more clearly than we did. But I think one person who saw the threat clearly even earlier was Milton Friedman when he was talking about the handover of Hong Kong to China. He said the outcome is going to be one of two alternatives. Either China will become more like Hong Kong or Hong Kong will become more like China. And that's what the battle in Hong Kong is about today, but it's really about the bigger picture too.
Can I just follow up that? Because, successive administrations, Democratic and Republican, have basically adopted the same attitude towards China, which is if we trade with them more, if we invest with them more, eventually they'll become more like us. Eventually they'll become a more democratic society. They will adopt to the international norms. I mean, was everyone wrong?
Yeah, well, those are basically the two premises I talk about in the book, and they were wrong. We have been wrong on so many aspects of the Chinese regime that it's only when we're kind of shocked by things like annexing the South China Sea as a province of China, like the threat to Taiwan, like what's happening in Hong Kong, like the concentration camps of the Uyghurs, and it's a long list that you go there. It takes a while, but I do think there's a fundamental change in opinion. It's still developing around the world. Just in the past days, we've had Britain reversing itself essentially 180 degrees, banning Huawei from 5G telecommunication systems. So there's a lot of catching up to do, but I think there's a growing sense that we were taken in by China, we were naive, we've paid a price for that. I don't think it's an irreparable price, but it's a substantial price we now have to overcome.
And can I ask you again, and switching to the COVID-19 pandemic going on, you wrote in your book, there is little doubt that China delayed, withheld, fabricated, and distorted information about the origin, timing, spread, and extent of the virus. But it seems now, because of the way China seems to have contained it and the way the United States seems to have bungled it, a lot of countries are saying, yeah, China did make these mistakes that you outline in the book, but they've done a lot better job at it than we have. And a lot of people are saying maybe the China model is a better model. If this authoritarian government could shut down cities, they could make people wear masks. And the U.S., we seem to be floundering. I mean, how do you respond to that?
Yeah. Well, with George Orwell's definition of totalitarianism in 1984, which is a boot stomping on a human head forever. I mean, if you can shut down a whole country and stop a disease, the saying in the U.S. is the government that's big enough to give you anything you want is big enough to take everything you have. I don't necessarily believe this disease has been defeated in China. You keep seeing stories from the government itself about outbreaks caused by foreigners coming back into China or outbreaks along the Russian border. This suggests to me that the problem remains. They're still not telling the truth. The problem on the U.S. side of not coping effectively with the disease is real. And I address that in the book briefly. Events get beyond the point I had to go to the publisher. But I think President Trump in, we'll say, January and February of this year, despite red flags being raised by people on the National Security Council staff, people at the Centers for Disease Control, simply didn't want to hear any bad news. Didn't want to hear bad news about Xi Jinping, his buddy. Didn't want to hear bad news about the spread of the disease in China in a way that might adversely affect China's ability to purchase American agricultural products. And most importantly, didn't want to hear any potential bad news about the disease spreading in the United States that might adversely affect the U.S. economy and thereby harm his ticket to re-election. So I think Trump lost us 2, maybe even 3 months when steps might have been taken that could have substantially affected the course of the disease. And even today, which I think unfortunately is also reflective of his national security policy, which of course I try and describe in the book, is utterly without strategy or policy. It is incoherent. We saw in the press conference yesterday in the Rose Garden 5 or 6 minutes on the steps you mentioned about taking steps against Beijing, and then an hour of incoherence, which reminded me a lot of my meetings with the president.
You were national security advisor when the Hong Kong protests started. So we're from here in Hong Kong. I mean, what advice were you giving the president? What was he hearing? What did he think of these protests? I mean, we're really curious about that.
Well, certainly he understood the protest to be significant in size. I don't think he missed that point. But he was resolute in not wanting to do anything about it or to get involved in it. So just as an example, we were actually, I think, in Paris at the time, and it was the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square. And so my staff had prepared a statement. The White House has issued statements every 5 years on Tiananmen. It was not an outrageous statement. I mean, I liked it, but I can assure you it was not something I would have said on my own as a private citizen. It was very restrained. Gave it to the president. He would not issue it. And when he found that the State Department had issued its own separate statement earlier, he told Pompeo to withdraw it. This is consistent with, as I relate in the book, what he said to Xi Jinping about the camps for the Uyghurs, reflected in a complete lack of any interest in the question of religious tolerance, or really much else that got in the way of the great white whale of the Trump administration, the big trade deal. That's what he wants. And that's what I think it's entirely possible if he wins re-election, he'll be right back to in November.
Yeah, and one more question on China. There's been this military movement going on. The U.S. is moving carriers into that area. The Chinese have been building these artificial islands there. I mean, are we heading towards a military confrontation in the South China Sea?
Well, we may be because of failures of U.S. policy in the past. You know, for many, many years, it was U.S. policy that the conflicting territorial disputes in the South China Sea should be resolved by peaceful negotiation. I can recite that from memory. That was the position. Now, that's been changed, and the U.S. government now rejects China's claims, therefore in favor of the other competing claimants, presumably. One can debate whether or not we should have done that earlier or whether we should even do it today. But I think where we were badly mistaken was in not having a much more aggressive freedom of navigation effort in the South China Sea. And I think we failed in going to the other states, Vietnam, Philippines, and others that have their own territorial claims and say, listen, where you have claims one against the other, you need to work this out right now. You need a common front against China, because China's not going to listen to decisions of the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. They're building, in the Middle East, what we call facts on the ground. They're building the ground, and then they're building the facts on top of them.
Yeah, interesting. And it's fascinating. And one question, I mean, is South China Sea really strategically important for the United States? And why do we care?
Yeah, well, if you look at the flow of international trade through the South China Sea, what could happen if that shifted from international waters, or at least where there are waters of rights of innocent passage, to Chinese territorial waters, it could be enormous. Just as one example, the amount of oil from the Middle East going through the South China Sea to Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, something like 90% of their total supply of oil. So if China grabbed that by the throat, they'd have those three economies in a death grip.
Oh, interesting. And just one question on China before we switch topics came in from the audience asking if what happened to the phase one trade deal that was agreed to in January or so, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, the phase one deal was basically a truce through the American election. I mean, that's my assessment of it, having watched the negotiations before. China engaged in discussions on what we on the American side call the structural issues, theft of intellectual property and whatnot, and then backed off concessions it looked like it was going to make. It did that in 2018. Even then, there was no enforcement mechanism. If China pledged not to steal intellectual property and then did it, it was hard to see what the U.S. reaction would be. So the phase one deal was this. This goes to the point of Trump saying, buy more agricultural products, help me in the farm states, help me get reelected. Now, I'll let the economic statisticians debate how close China is to meeting its so-called commitments under the phase one deal. But I think 5 years from now, if you talk about the phase one trade deal, 99% of the people involved will look at you with a blank face and say, what was that?
Right. And sorry, one other question came on China before we switch topics. Someone just asked the question, there's a lot of talk about decoupling. The U.S. and China maybe are decoupling economically. We used to talk about chimerica. The two are so intertwined they can't. Now we're talking about decoupling. Is that really possible?
Well, I think it's not only possible, I think it's happening. I think people are looking in incremental decisions. We're not gonna wake up tomorrow and find that it's occurred, but incrementally they are looking at elements of their supply chain in China and thinking about moving it somewhere else, to Southeast Asia, Vietnam, other countries, bringing it back to the Western Hemisphere. And I think one element of the global trade environment that's changing is that the notion of political risk, and I don't mean just war, revolution, and insurrection, expropriation, but what China does to foreign businesses in China, stealing their intellectual property is a good example, and are thinking more and more about where they place orders and their own capital investment. I think there's a whole separate issue when we get to the Huaweis and ZTEs of the world that are state actors on behalf of China, engaged in the kind of not just industrial espionage, but state espionage that would boggle the mind of a U.S. or European telecommunications company. I can imagine Silicon Valley being approached by the U.S. to do what Huawei does every day. You can guess what the reaction would be. And I think people are going to take that into account too. The regime in Beijing has a completely different system in mind. It's not a Marxist system, it's a totalitarian system.
Sure. And a question about Hong Kong. The new national security law is now reality. What do you think of that, and what do you think Hong Kong people should do now? I mean,
well, I think it must be very discouraging for the people in Hong Kong. They've fought so long. They thought they had another 25 plus years before they had to worry about this. I'm sure this is very discouraging, and I think they look at Donald Trump and wonder themselves if anybody in Washington is still paying attention. So I guess my suggestion would be understand just how broad and deep the support for Hong Kong freedom is in the United States, and I think in the West and the industrial democracies more broadly. Don't think that anybody's giving up on you. And bear in mind also that while it's understandable the focus is what's going on in Hong Kong, this has China-wide implications and worldwide implications. The spotlight of the press is on Hong Kong now, but I think the protesters and those who want a democracy in Hong Kong and freedom ought to bear in mind that history has the spotlight on them too. And Winston Churchill said to the British people at their darkest hour, let's so bear ourselves that 1,000 years from now, people will still say this was their finest hour. Now, I think this can be Hong Kong's finest hour. I think that's what all the people of Hong Kong should bear in mind. It's for them, but it's for the rest of us too. So we're with you. Don't give up.
Is there anything else the administration can do, or with these sanctions that are already put on? Have we already fired all the arrows in the quiver? Is there nothing else that the U.S. could
No,
do?
I think there's a lot more here. And I think this goes with this overall reassessment of what China's doing, what its objectives are, and what the U.S. response ought to be. And I think that can have significant impact on China. I mean, I'll just pick one example. One victory that the people of Hong Kong have already achieved is that in Taiwan, where the one country, two systems proposal was originally intended, there is no political leader in Taiwan now that would argue for closer ties with Beijing as a serious proposition. They've seen what happened there. And so I think that I've recommended this for a long time, but it's a kind of asymmetric pressure on China. I would have the U.S. extend full diplomatic recognition to Taiwan and see what they think of that in Beijing.
Well, let me switch to a couple of other topics before we get to some questions coming in from the audience. One I wanted to ask you about, in the book, you had a really fascinating conversation where you're talking to John Kelly, the White House Chief of Staff, talking about the chaotic nature of decision-making. And he said at one point, what if we had a real crisis like 9/11 with the way he makes decisions? Is the coronavirus that 9/11? Are we looking at that now?
Well, I think it's not exactly like 9/11, but the economic and social effect it could have on the United States if we don't get a grip on this could well be true. What worries me especially is that countries that have biological weapons programs or terrorists that aspire to get that capability, recognizing that the epidemiological effects of a pandemic are not that dissimilar from a large bioweapons attack, are seeing that we're stumbling all over ourselves, and rather than pursuing nuclear weapons, biological weapons, which are cheaper, more difficult to handle in some respects, but that's why they're called the poor man's nuclear weapon, look a lot more interesting. But I think quite apart from that concern, the world as a whole hasn't dealt very effectively with this. I don't think Europe's kind of a shining example for the United States. We're making plenty of mistakes. I think the president's at the head of the line in terms of responsibility because he has not thought this through. I mean, now we have, just today, your attendees may not know this yet, but Peter Navarro, the trade advisor, has an op-ed in USA Today attacking Dr. Fauci, the head of Centers for Disease Control. And if you don't believe it's an attack, please read it for yourselves. What is going on here? What is going on? And the press conference yesterday, the incoherence of it was part of it. When you have this kind of threat, you need a comprehensive strategy. You need to deal with the fact America is a federal system. There are a lot of ramifications for this. And it's going to take a real concentrated effort by the government. It takes time by the president, time by his senior advisors, all dedicated to working out how to resolve the issue. That's not what we're doing. We're nowhere close to that.
Yeah, and the other crisis going on, I guess you could call it, in the U.S. right now, is this kind of protest movement for racial equality or for justice. I know you're a foreign policy guy, but I'd love to ask from a foreign policy perspective, how much does the racial problem that's been persistent in the United States for a long time, how much does that affect our ability to promote democracy around the world, to promote human rights around the world? And I say that because when this killing took place of this George Floyd in Minneapolis, the Chinese propaganda machine, the Iranian propaganda machine, they were on Twitter highlighting this and saying, why are you lecturing us? You've got your own problems. I mean, how much do we have to solve our own domestic problems to be a force on the world stage?
Well, I think every time there's evidence we haven't solved our problems, it hurts us. I mean, this was first really visible, I think, in the 60s. When John Kennedy was president and pursuing a very idealistic American foreign policy, faced with foreign diplomats being discriminated against in Washington. So not even American people, but foreign diplomats. And I think that was a bit of an impetus for the civil rights movement. There were plenty of other reasons for it as well, to be sure. But the adverse light in which America was portrayed, I think, was on people's minds, and properly so. I guess the point I would make is that our secret in the United States is coming out. Turns out we're filled with human beings, and we're all imperfect, and we make mistakes. But the racism that still exists, the discrimination, all represent deviations from the American ideal. These are imperfections in our system. This is not something that we aspire to. This is something we aspire to remedy. So we weren't covering it up because we were afraid of people finding out what we really believe. What we really believe is that these situations need to be resolved satisfactorily, peacefully, and in a civil political discourse. And I think it's America's opportunity and America's desire to correct imperfections, not to leave them linger, not to manage them, but to cure them, that helps distinguish America. And, we just have to take the good for the bad when it happens like this.
Sure. And let me ask you one specific question about human rights, press freedom. I mean, in your book, you make it pretty clear that you have a kind of low opinion of the press. I think in the epilogue, you talked about the usual media bias, laziness, lack of education and professionalism, et cetera. I mean, would you agree with President Trump that the journalists are the enemies of the people? And don't you think that kind of rhetoric coming out of the White House, gives kind of opportunities for dictators around the world to suppress their own journalists?
Yeah. Well, I don't think the press are enemies of the people, and I don't think the president of the United States ought to be saying that. That said, I do think the press is very liberal in its political bias. I think it's slipshod. I think they do have a short attention span, and I think there's a kind of political correctness in the establishment press in the United States that undercuts their own pretensions. I mean, just now we've had an extraordinary letter from an editorial board member of the New York Times resigning, Barry Weiss. It's in all the papers today, a scathing account of what it's like inside the New York Times. Andrew Sullivan leaving his publication. There's a lot going on, I think, that shows the extent of this bias. And I don't mind jousting with the press. I guess that's one reason I'm with you today. But I don't think I should hide my opinion of it either. If the press were overwhelmed with conservatives, and it was politically to the right, you'd certainly hear it from the left. That's for sure.
I guess because here out in Asia we've got Maria Ressa in the Philippines who's threatened with a jail sentence. We've got journalists who were jailed in Myanmar, and a lot of them are actually echoing the words out of the White House. They're talking about fake news and enemies of the people. How can the U.S. stand up for press freedom around the world when we hear that kind of rhetoric coming out of Washington?
Well, I think it's very unhelpful. And look, you're talking to somebody with a great deal of sympathy. President Trump tried to suppress my book. He desperately did not want to come out before the election, not because he was afraid of foreign governments reading what was in the book. He was afraid of the American people reading it. And I'm not alone. His family tried to suppress his own niece's book, which has just come out. So, as I say, I have a certain amount of sympathy in that regard.
Well, thank you for that answer. You're at the Foreign Correspondents Club. We all appreciate that. One more question for me, and then we got a couple coming in from the audience. I want to ask you on the impeachment question. You said the Democrats had failed to develop a full and accurate record so that House Republicans might have been inclined to at least consider the articles. And when I read that, I was thinking, oh, come on, no Republican in this environment was ever going to support articles of impeachment. I mean, do you really think there was a possibility of getting some Republicans over?
Well, I do, and one reason I think that became impossible very quickly is that the advocates of impeachment in the House made two decisions almost instantaneously when the Ukraine whistleblower letter emerged. Number one, that they would focus only on the Ukraine issue, and number two, they would move very quickly. The latter decision, in many respects, is the more important one for our purposes here, because they were concerned about adversely affecting the Democratic Party presidential nomination process. Now, I understand it was politically inconvenient for them to have to worry about that. But, if your claim is you've got an abuse of governmental power, you ought to be prepared to take the time to lay that out and to see if there's more to it than just the Ukraine issue. But that didn't suit their political needs. And in a way, it was analogous to what they were accusing Trump of, and correct in the allegation that Trump torqued legitimate government power, the provision of security assistance to the Ukraine, around his own political fortunes, wanting Ukraine to launch investigations of Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. And what the House impeachment advocates did was torque the grave power of impeachment around their presidential nomination schedule. That's why I called it impeachment malpractice. I don't know what the chances were of the phenomenon we saw in the Watergate scandal, where Republicans did come over and become convinced Nixon would leave. But whatever chances there were swept aside right at the beginning of the impeachment effort.
Well, and one of the main points of your book was that President Trump was basically driving foreign policy for his own reelection purposes. I actually only just recently discovered the title of your book, "The Room Where It Happened," was taken from the Hamilton play, where Hamilton, in the play, they say, no one really knows how the game is played, the art of the trade, how the sausage gets made. We just assume that it happens because no one else is in the room where it happens. But my question is, isn't it always the case that domestic politics somehow drives foreign policy? And I'm thinking presidential candidates making promises on Cuba when they're campaigning in Miami, or filing steel WTO complaints against China when they're campaigning in Pennsylvania. Isn't that just kind of how the sausage gets made?
Well, I think every president takes domestic political factors into account in foreign policy. I think probably every leader in a democratic society does that. The difference with Trump is that the domestic politics shift from being a factor in the decision making in many cases to being the factor in the decision making, where the policy arguments back and forth didn't sway him one way or the other, but the threat of a revolt among congressional Republicans was enough to drive him in what was usually what I considered to be the right direction. So I worry in the second Trump term, if he wins this November, freed of that political constraint, who knows what he's going to do? This goes to the China point directly. If he doesn't have to worry about re-election, what on November the 4th, it's entirely possible he calls his buddy Xi Jinping and says, hey, let's get back to the trade deal.
That actually segues into a great question that came in while we were speaking here. The question is, if you had the opportunity to brief the next president of the United States, whoever that might be, what would you advise them to do about China?
Well, no matter who wins in November, I don't expect they're going to ask, but I've laid a lot of it out here today. I think you have to look at the policy of the past 40 years as resting on beliefs that have not proven to be true empirically. And if you can't reassess a policy after 40 years of following what turned out to be an incorrect line, I don't know what the right time is, but on trade, on military issues, on the North Korean nuclear program, on security in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, there are a lot of things that need to be reassessed on a fairly urgent basis. And as I've indicated before, I don't think this is just a U.S. question either. I think talking to the Europeans, for example, they say all the time, why does Trump focus on how much he dislikes the European Union and their trade practices when we have so much in common in our concern with what China's doing? Japan would say the same thing. And I think there's a lot to that.
And someone is asking, in your opinion, which presidential candidate's policy agenda do you believe would serve the U.S. best over the next 4 years?
Neither one. It's not a happy election for me in November. And I've said, this is the first time in my adult life I'm not going to vote for the Republican nominee for president because I don't think he has a philosophy. It's not just that he's not a conservative Republican. He's not a liberal Democrat either. He's Donald Trump. And that's what determines what he will do. And after 17 months of watching it up close and personal, I just cannot in good conscience vote for it again. I'm not going to vote for Joe Biden. I think philosophically, I just can't cross that bridge. I understand a lot of Republicans probably will. I respect that, but I'm not going to do it. I'm going to write in the name of a conservative leader, and it's going to be a bad election at the presidential level. What I'm doing politically is I'm going to spend my time trying to keep a Republican majority in the Senate as a check on Biden if he does get elected.
And I just want to ask a question about that, because if a lot of Republicans who think that Trump is unfit for a second term chose to either sit it out or write in someone else, isn't that basically just wasting a vote? Don't you almost have an obligation to vote for somebody who might win?
No, no, I don't think so. Look, I admit I've changed my mind since 2016. Asked that question in 2016, I would have said, considering the alternative, of course I'm going to vote for Trump, and I did vote for Trump. But now
Mm.
I've seen the alternative in action, and I've been up close to it, and I cannot do that again. As a matter of arithmetic, a Trump 2016 voter who votes for Biden in 2020 is shifting 2 votes. Trump down 1, Biden up 1. Somebody like myself who writes in somebody else takes 1 vote away from Trump. So the arithmetic is still favorable to Biden, just not as much as if you actually pulled the lever.
And one of our members asked a very interesting question here. They asked, did you ever respect President Trump? And why did you bother going to work for him?
Well, I explain in the book that questioner is invited to buy a copy of it and take a look at it. I didn't go in naively. I heard the criticisms about Trump, but I'd also had a lot of conversations with him, and he knows where I stand. I told him in meetings we had. He watched me on Fox News for 10 years. Nobody's ever accused me of being shy about making my opinions known, and he gave me the offer, and I accepted it because I thought. The U.S. did face a significant number of foreign policy threats and challenges. We had a lot of mistakes to recover from the Obama administration. I thought I could make a contribution, and that's what I tried to do. So I don't apologize for that. I just learned my lesson over the next 17 minutes.
And a very good follow-up question. Someone asked the question, what's your biggest regret during your time in the administration?
Well, I was not successful in correcting a lot of the mistakes I think that the president made. Let's just take North Korea as an example. After 2 years plus of his summit diplomacy with Kim Jong-un, that has collapsed totally. I mean, physically as well as rhetorically. The North Koreans blew up the liaison building they had constructed to meet with the South Koreans a few weeks ago. That doesn't mean it was a net even walk away from the situation. The North Koreans have now had 3.5 years of making further progress on their nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs. So that left us behind, and it was a waste of time because the North Koreans are never going to voluntarily give up their pursuit of nuclear weapons. And what Trump did, I think, blinded the country, blinded the United States to what was really happening.
You don't think it was better that at least they were talking instead of trading these insults and talking about fire and fury and possible war?
Well, trading the insults wasn't doing much either, and it wasn't part of a strategy, as anybody can see. I mean, I think in a disciplined presidency, which we obviously don't have now, every public comment of the president is part of an overall strategy. With North Korea, whether they were being insulted or whether they were being coddled by Trump, they were still advancing their nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs. That's the issue. We let that happen. We slowed it down somewhat because of enhanced sanctions. But even there, that was a policy that was pursued inconsistently as well.
And an interesting question came in. It says, you describe in your book that Taiwan is at the top of the list of those that Trump would abandon. Can Taiwan now reliably depend on the U.S. for support?
Well, I think it can depend on the people in the United States and overwhelming bipartisan support in Congress. To give you another Winston Churchill quote, he once said, you can always count on the United States to do the right thing, usually after it's tried everything else. And right now, what we're going through is trying everything else. And it's because to Trump, everything is transactional, everything is a deal. And I describe in the book how he would hold his Sharpie pen up and point to the tip of it and say, that's Taiwan. And then he'd point to the Resolute desk, which is a huge desk, and he'd say, that's China. That's what his friends from Wall Street told him, because they were making more money in China. Probably they weren't making anything in Taiwan. But that's not where I think the political view in Congress is. Again, rare in a time when we have very little bipartisanship. I think support for Taiwan maintaining its separate status and indeed deepening ties with the United States remains very strong.
And another member is asking, in your opinion, how big is the risk of a military conflict between the United States and China?
Well, I think it's very remote at this point. I think the provocations here are essentially all Chinese in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, in attacking in Ladakh against India. And its military buildup is an adjunct to that. Just as one example, in cyberspace, it's publicly known that one of the targets of the Chinese a couple of years ago was that they extracted all of the U.S. government's personnel records from the Office of Personnel Management, and they're now in some computer somewhere in Beijing. Now, what that means, just to take my case as an example, all of my FBI investigations for security clearances and positions in the federal government for 40 years now can be read by your local Chinese security officer. Now, my life is pretty boring, so I'm not terribly worried about it. But look at what they've extracted, and we've just sat there for years, for decades, really, and let this happen. So I think that we're going to see a lot more conflict along those lines. I think one accomplishment, and I discuss this in the book, is we now have more of a decision-making system that allows offensive U.S. cyber operations to build up structures of deterrence, to convince China, Russia, and others, if you're doing it to us, you're going to get it back, and at an even higher cost. You better think twice before you come against us. This is, I just think the struggle for between China and the United States and the two different systems of life that they represent could well define the 21st century.
But you don't see any immediate prospect of any kind of a military clash.
I don't see it anything like the near term, and hopefully it gives Beijing a chance to back away from some of its provocative behavior. I don't see any evidence of that, but from their point of view, why should they? They've succeeded for 40 years in stealing from us. Why give up a successful approach?
Sure. And we have another question that just came in. It absolutely has to be from a Canadian, because the question asks, what do you think about the state of U.S.-Canada relations right now? I guess the backdrop of that is, how could we possibly be having a bad relationship with Canada? I mean, they're a northern neighbor, and we've always gotten along pretty well.
Right. Well, there were a lot of trade frictions. This is in the revision of NAFTA to what is now called the USMCA. This is part of the question I think a lot of Americans have, as well as Canadians and others. Why are we fighting with Canada when our big issue is with China on trade? Now, NAFTA reform is behind us. We've still got the Huawei issue. After Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou at the request of the United States pending her extradition, China arbitrarily seized two Canadian citizens as hostages. And some in Canada are upset about that. They want to have a prisoner exchange in effect. I think that's a big mistake. I've elaborated on that last week in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. But that has exacerbated relations as well. I mean, again, I think when Donald Trump disappears, whether it's after the November election or 4 years later, there's a lot of damage to repair. I think if it's only one term, we can repair it fairly easily. 2 terms, I'm much more worried.
And I remember reading in your book, a lot of it's personal, right? He just didn't like the fact that he thought Trudeau had insulted him by giving a press conference and criticizing him in a press conference. How much of his interpersonal relations with foreign leaders are just how they treat him personally?
Well, that's a lot of it. He has trouble distinguishing between a good personal relationship with a foreign leader and the underlying bilateral relationship. I'm not discounting personal relations. They can be important. But I know for a hard, cruel fact that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin don't have any trouble distinguishing between their national interest and their personal relations. That's why when Donald Trump sits across the table from him, it's not a fair fight. And they have learned in their own way. Macron learned, Trudeau learned. They've all learned one way or another how to play the president, and flattery gets you a long way with Trump, and he doesn't seem to realize that. It's really remarkable for somebody who wrote a book called The Art of the Deal, how expertly our foreign adversaries in particular know how to play him.
What do you think Putin has on Trump, if anything?
I don't think there's any evidence he has anything on him. I think there's this remarkable affinity that Trump has for our adversaries, especially our authoritarian-led foreign countries. Before he left for a NATO summit and then a meeting with Theresa May and then the famous Helsinki summit with Putin, Trump said to the press, I think the meeting with Putin could be the easiest of all of them. Whoever would have thought that? And the answer is nobody would have thought it except for him.
Yeah. Interesting. And on the another member is asking a question on diplomacy. They're saying you've heard of this phrase. China has this wolf warrior diplomats now going out and being aggressive diplomats. They're saying you are a well-known hawk yourself. So do you appreciate these wolf warriors, or what do you think about who wins in a wolf versus a hawk?
Yeah, I'm actually a pretty mild-mannered guy myself. I mean, my philosophical positions are what they are, but I think we've seen examples of this backfiring on China already in its relations in Southeast Asia and some of the Pacific Island states, where they've made enormous strides with what we call debt diplomacy, which is providing what seem to be very attractive financial terms at the front end of a deal or a foreign aid project, but which get the recipient government in real trouble later. That's increasingly resented, and the sort of arrogant attitude of the Chinese diplomats is increasingly resented too. So I think that's something that the Chinese don't yet recognize, but I think it's becoming more apparent to everybody who's the target of it.
Great. And someone is just asking the question here is, do you think some of these international relations can be repaired in another term if Trump is gone, or how much do you think is damage beyond repair?
Well, I don't think any of it is beyond repair. I think a lot of this has been exaggerated to a certain extent, and I think people recognize Trump as an anomaly, and at least I hope that's correct. And I think even a Biden administration could fix it. I still my plan is hope here that there's still a chance to get a conservative Republican in November where we could do a lot more, but I'm not waiting by the phone for that to happen.
And so one more question circling back to Hong Kong. Someone is asking a little bit sensitive questions as we sit here. They're asking, what support did the United States give to Hong Kong's pro-democracy protests, if any? Yeah.
Well, I think because the president was largely silent during this period, and indeed things he said to Xi Jinping could have given Xi Jinping the impression that he had a green light. But that does not reflect where the body politic in the United States is. And so there wasn't assistance because it wasn't coming from the president, that's for sure. But in terms of political support, and I think now some of the steps you can see, the legislation that Congress has passed by overwhelming majorities demonstrates where the people of the U.S. are.
It's interesting because China likes to say that this was all driven by foreign forces who were like putting people out on the streets or encouraging this.
Yeah, if only we were so smart.
And someone is asking the question, what's the likelihood that the U.S. would use the so-called nuclear option, meaning cut off China's access to dollars, or Hong Kong's dollar is pegged to the U.S. dollar? Is that something that's feasible in your view or not?
Well, it's obviously a subject of discussion. It's been raised as a possibility. The Wall Street Journal has said they're not wild about the prospect. I think it depends on what happens in Hong Kong, and that's why I say I mentioned earlier. I think this could be Hong Kong's finest hour, and it's very important that they not compromise on their principles, and that really it's incumbent on both them and the rest of us to spread this discussion in the rest of China. If the whole position is trying to defend the one country, two systems deal for Hong Kong, you're fighting a totally defensive struggle. I think you've got Dwight Eisenhower like to say, if you can't solve a problem, expand it. So my recommendation would be expand it to all of China. Why shouldn't the rest of China enjoy what people in Hong Kong were supposedly guaranteed in the handover deal?
And someone is asking the question, do you think this national security law that's been imposed on Hong Kong is all bad, or is there any benefit to it at all, or how do you see this?
Well, I haven't read the actual statute itself, so I can't say that there aren't some phrases in it I might agree with. But this is typical of authoritarian regimes. It's cloaked in in arguments about constitutional security, and then basically it takes your freedom of speech away and everything else. Every application of it that I've read or heard about it, I think has been deplorable.
And then a question from myself. When you look around the world at the moment, everything going on, you've got Korea, still got Iran, you've got China and the U.S. What keeps you up at night most?
Well, I think the threat of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, and biological, is the immediate threat that we see. I put China and Russia, I would still put Russia in the category of strategic threat. So ultimately, they are potentially far more dangerous, but it's something that will work its way out over a longer period. If the coronavirus pandemic has told us anything, it's that, as I mentioned before, the biological weapons threat is real. We mostly talk about the nuclear side, but we need to keep the other weapons of mass destruction in mind as well. If they fall into the hands of terrorist groups that don't have a homeland that can be retaliated against, it's much harder to deter. So it's a great concern.
Okay, and actually, speaking of COVID, which you just mentioned, someone's saying, what do you think about the Trump administration withdrawing from the WHO, the World Health Organization? Good move or not a good move?
Yeah, I think the WHO failed miserably, particularly in the early days. It's a large bureaucracy. I've dealt with it going back to my days at USAID and the Reagan administration, and then in subsequent administrations as well. The U.S. pays 25% of the assessed budget. Nobody pays any attention to what we have to say. It wouldn't have been the first UN specialized agency I would have withdrawn from. But as when we withdrew from UNESCO in the Reagan administration, I think it could cause people to sit up and take notice. It's really the defenders of the UN system that ought to be the strongest advocates of reform. You can walk through the halls of the WHO. I'm sure there are many, many, many good people in there, but it's a huge bureaucracy. And you say to yourself, what exactly is going on here? And that's something all the UN agencies ought to be asking themselves.
And I think I know how you're going to answer this next one, but someone's asking the question, doesn't America have its own national security law? I think they're referring to the anti-terrorism laws put in after 9/11. They're saying, why is China so different in putting in its own kind of version of a national security law over Hong Kong?
Well, the difference is the American Constitution and the Bill of Rights, an independent judiciary that enforces these constitutional provisions, and the hot debate that you can see anytime something is proposed in that area. We've just recently had a debate in terms of the reauthorization of the Patriot Act. It's covered by the newspapers. That this is what happens in a democratic society. That's the difference, and I'd say it's huge.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think the courts oversee things in the under the Patriot Act in the U.S. Here they have warrantless wiretapping, warrantless surveillance. So I think there's a lot of differences there. I just want to ask you a couple of questions in a couple of minutes. Thank you for all the time, by the way. Oh, sorry. And someone's following up with that question, asking, what's the difference between China's Xinjiang policy and what's going on with Trump's immigration policy? Is there any comparison there?
Yeah. Now, look, the fact is that what's happening in Xinjiang is a kind of cultural and perhaps ethnic genocide. That has not been much covered by the outside world, but which we're seeing more and more evidence of. Immigration here is a question that every sovereign nation decides for itself who gets in and who doesn't get in. If the nations through which a lot of these immigrants in the Western Hemisphere passed did their job, they never would have made it to the U.S. border. And what Trump is basically saying is we should push them back to the countries where people are claiming asylum, as international refugee law contemplates, push them back to the country of first asylum. And these are not concentration camps. My God, the press is all over them. Is it hardship? Sure, it's also hardship to leave your home in Guatemala and walk through Mexico because you think you're going to get into the United States. And I think if people understood that there's a process to gain legal immigration into the United States, they wouldn't engage in this activity in the first place. Nobody's trying to exacerbate the hardship. The whole point is to explain to people just by showing up at the border doesn't mean you're going to get in. Personally, I favor considerably greater immigration. And I think what Britain, Canada, and others have done in terms of potential political asylum for Hong Kong is something the United States should do too. So I favor more immigration. I think it's what makes America strong. It has historically. That's the big advantage we have over almost every other country in the world. The only issue is who decides who gets in. And I think the current we, the people of the United States, decide, not the outsiders.
And just a couple more questions, one from the audience and one final one from me. I'll pick this one from the audience. Someone is saying, that's a good question. What's your reaction to Mary Trump's new book? If you've read it or if at least read the revelations in it. I apologize. She displaced you as #1 on the Amazon bestseller list now. But if you know what she's talking about, does that comport with what you know or what you've seen of the president?
Well, I'm not a shrink, and she is, and so I don't do the psychological thing. I haven't read it, I have to say, but I think this is an example of what happens when in Trump's world when he tries to suppress disagreement with him. It just makes it get more attention, and you'd think after a while he would learn, but learning is not his strong suit, and that's a big problem as long as he's president. Nobody comes into the presidency knowing everything. Everybody's got to learn. Most presidents care about learning in areas they're not familiar with because it didn't come up in their background. Trump is not interested in learning.
Well, okay, and I want to let you go in the next couple of minutes, but I do want to get one last question. This is my question to you is, if Donald Trump loses, which we don't know what's going to happen, but the Republican Party, is that now a Trump party, or will it be rebuilt into something that we recognize as the old Republican Party? And what will your role be in that?
Well, I believe it is absolutely not the Trump Republican Party. And I think after November, whether Trump wins or loses, more immediately, obviously, if he loses, there's got to be a serious discussion about what the future of the party is. I hope and expect I will play a large role in it. I think I bring a certain experience to the discussion that could be helpful. Since I left the administration in September, I can't count the number of people who have called and talked with me or emailed or corresponded. That's certainly continued and even increased since the book came out. I think there are a lot of people who have not given voice to their views publicly, including a lot in Congress. Nobody wants to be subjected to a 2 minutes hate from Trump in his Twitter feed. But I don't think they accept that he is the future of the Republican Party, and there'll be a lot of work to do. I don't dispute it, but this is critical, I think, for the party and therefore for the country. So absolutely, the battle will be on the day after the election.
Will we see Bolton 2024 for president?
No, that I can say with confidence. I'm not going to do that in part because, and I'm not trying to pat myself on the back. I want to be involved in this debate about what the party looks like, and I don't want anybody saying, well, he's just doing it in preparation for a run for the presidency. So this will be purely from a philosophical point of view.
If you change your mind and decide to run, will you announce it at the FCC here in Hong Kong?
Well, those are probably two things that won't happen, but I'd love to come back to the FCC someday, that's for sure.
Well, the book is here, the room where it happened. You did not make it happen here in the room, but you did it in the Zoom room for us. And for that, we are forever grateful. Thank you for coming in and talking to us. And for everybody who was in the session here, I wanted to just say thank you for joining us, Ambassador Bolton. It was a really lively discussion. You gave us an hour of your time. We really appreciate that. It's early morning for you. It's late at night here for us. But again, thank you very much. We really appreciate your coming in and spending time with us. People can pick up the book, I believe, on Amazon or anywhere else. I'm sure everybody already has read it because they're asking such great questions in. But again, thank you very much, Ambassador John Bolton.
Well, thanks for moderating, and thanks to the FCC, and thanks to Kin Ming Liu for going through the trouble of setting it up. But I was glad to do it, and as I say, one day hope to see you all in person again.
All right, take care. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.